Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Staffing for 2023 and 24, Expand Options and Fill Gaps with Remote Teachers. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eSchool News, and I am happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by Stride. Stride has transformed millions of people's teaching and learning experiences by providing innovative, high-quality, tech-enabled education solutions, curriculum, and programs directly to students, schools, the military, and enterprises in the primary, secondary, and post-secondary settings. As part of the larger Stride family, Stride Learning Solutions has partnered with school districts for more than 20 years to collaboratively solve district challenges. Their flexible online and blended learning options boost modern instruction and promote lifelong student success. Now, before we get to our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some features of the platform that we're using for this. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. If you have a question or comment, there is a chat function that you can use. Feel free to use it to contact someone from eSchool News if you have a technical question, but also for our panelists, if you have a question or an idea or a thought that you want to contribute to the conversation, it really kind of helps us guide the conversation going forward for this next hour. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation and some introductions. First, Rick Perkins. Rick is the VP of Innovative Instructional Models for Stride. He joined the Stride team in early 2022 with a wealth of knowledge from his career as a school leader. He started as a classroom teacher, moved to the role of Dean of Students, and ultimately became a principal. He then transitioned to being the Director of Instructional Operations at Florida Virtual School. Rick, I'd say the granddaddy of online schools.
Right.
Rick spent the next 9 years as VP of Instructional Services at Edmentum, where he created and implemented success coaching, tutoring, career academy, and school mentoring, all for the virtual school setting. Since joining Stride, Rick has used his experience to focus on restructuring the organization. Also with us, Charlie Craighill. Charlie is a national account executive for Stride and with the Learning Solutions team, and he is responsible for new district sales and ensuring that products and services meet clients' needs and goals. Charlie also supports client communications for new partnerships to various district stakeholders and meets regularly with key points of contact to ensure program fidelity. Charlie joined Stride in 2016 after 7 years of teaching in DC public schools, where he taught remedial reading and Spanish. Charlie and Rick, thanks so much for joining me today. This is maybe not the most pleasant of conversations. I mean, the teacher shortages are really a difficult situation, probably the number one priority right now that district leaders are dealing with. Thousands of schools were understaffed last year, and as districts prepare for next year, many are considering supplementing their in-person teaching staff with remote instructional services. Districts using this solution are able to fill teaching gaps, keep class sizes down, and expand their course catalogs with remote certified teachers. I think to get a sense of the folks who are on the call with us here, we want to throw up a few poll questions so Rick and Charlie can have an idea of the state of play of the folks who are with us today. So Chris, if you could throw up that first poll question. Did your district have trouble filling positions in this past school year? Pretty easy one, yes or no. I'll give you a second to answer that. Okay, Chris, maybe we'll throw up the second one as well. Do you anticipate teacher shortages in the upcoming school year? Kind of interesting, and Charlie and Rick, we'll get into it in a second. I do want to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has kind of changed some of the dynamics when it comes to remote teaching solutions. Again, Rick, I mean, Florida Virtual Schools has been around for 20 years, was not, I'll assume, developed in anticipation of a global pandemic, but there we were, and it got to use, and it was really kind of a beta test for a lot of folks. So poll question number 3, Chris, thank you. If you can pull that up. For everybody watching, where are you having the most trouble filling positions? Is that at the elementary level, the middle or the high school level. Something else I kind of want to dig into a little bit, if the dynamics are different when it comes to different age groups and remote teaching. I'll assume that's a yes. There's a difference between a kindergartner and a senior in high school in a remote setup, but bookmark that one for later. I think we have one more question so to pull up, and then we'll start digging in. What types of teaching positions are you having the most trouble with filling at the secondary level specifically? So you have a bunch of choices there between English, math, science, social studies, special ed, and electives. Another good question for the audience, and another one that inspires me that hopefully we can talk a little bit about later too, is special education, because I think that there might be some particular dynamics there that separate themselves. But thanks everybody for answering those questions. But now maybe we'll dig in, and Rick, I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Okay.
What are you hearing out there in the field about teacher shortages during this past year and the year coming up?
Well, I think it's probably important just to take a step back and realize that I think we've been experiencing teacher shortage for years and years and years, right? And that virtual and online learning has been a tool and has played a role in mitigating some of those smaller situations in smaller school districts, specific subject areas that are maybe more challenging to recruit into, et cetera, by offering virtual and online options for those schools to take those, or for those students to take those specific classes. What we're seeing now is on a much grander scale, right? So instead of a small parish in New Orleans not being able to provide Spanish, we're talking about school districts, having 800 classrooms covered by subs in October of last year. So when it comes to count day, they're literally down, hundreds and hundreds of certified teachers. So I think we've reached a critical scale now, and we're seeing it across the country. We're seeing it in large school districts. We're seeing it in rural school districts, and we're seeing it across the different subject areas. We're having a hard time placing certified teachers in those classrooms post-pandemic. The kids have come back. A lot of teachers haven't. And so school districts are really struggling, to put a certified content expert in that classroom, in front of those kids, for accountability reasons, right? They need a certified teacher, but more importantly for the kids, right? You want to have that subject expert, that content expert, teaching kids subject area expertise. This is about kids learning and how limited school districts are when they have a permanent sub placed in that classroom as opposed to a content expert.
Yeah. Charlie, is what Rick talking about resonate with your experience?
Yeah, I in a lot of ways, having been here for 7 years, a lot of our contracts with school districts have been rooted in a shortage, right? But what Rick is saying in the former, right? 36 kids across 3 different campuses who need Spanish 3 and Spanish 2, districts, 4 or 5 years ago would use an online course. It's primarily asynchronous, and you would have a certified teacher on the back end grading, providing feedback, emailing with students. It was typically proctored by a computer lab model, a proctor. Right. It's mostly asynchronous, and that is not post-pandemic, moving forward with more tech infrastructures in place, not just with virtual schools, but in brick and mortar schools. Districts are also saying they want the remote instructional model to look as close to that next classroom that does have a certified teacher walking through the door. So it ticks up the synchronous level of instruction quite a bit, and it changes the model, I think.
Yeah. Well, the numbers from our recent polling here certainly match up to the conversation so far. 65% of folks online here had trouble filling positions this year, and 89% anticipate next year having that same issue. The other two answers, where you're having the most trouble filling positions, it would seem pretty evenly split there between the different grade levels, and that in terms of positions and the subject matter, math seemed to take the number one spot there. And I know in other conversations, Rick, I've had, when you're looking at different subjects, there are a lot of different dynamics when it comes to a remote setup. Can you talk a little bit about that? In terms of in terms of teaching math in a remote setup versus, say, a social studies, and when it comes, do you think that might be one of the reasons that folks are having a harder time finding math professionals?
Well, I think we're having a harder time finding, and I was just looking at the poll results, and and math is very high. Sciences are usually very high as well. These are harder areas to get certified in. And then I noticed special ed was also very high, and
Yeah.
we're certainly seeing that. We were seeing that pre-pandemic. We're certainly seeing it post-pandemic even more so. So in terms of the classroom setup, for remote instruction to really work well, there has to be a really strong partnership between the classroom facilitator and they go by many names, whether it's a paraprofessional, classroom facilitator, teacher's aide, whatever vernacular that we want to use. I prefer classroom facilitator because that person needs to be invested in student success. They're going to be there to handle the classroom management aspect of that period. They're also there, for that relationship with the kids, the relationship with the remote instructor. There has to be a lot of time for pre-planning, etc. Right. So it's a very important relationship. And when this works really well, those two folks really work hand in hand, together, specializing in their area, right? The classroom facilitator becomes kind of that specialist in classroom management and student motivation, et cetera, whereas the content expertise goes to that remote instructor. I don't know that there are significant differences between remote instruction and a math class versus a social studies class, in English class. We really want to use technology to make the lessons engaging. So in math, there is a lot of work on the whiteboard, right? Whether it's with eyeglass technology or, the math pens or whatever, because we want to mirror that classroom experience and that whiteboarding experience. We want to, work things out, but I don't know that that's specific to math. I want my English teachers to be able to, brainstorm, pre-essay. I want them to be able to, take student suggestions and write them up on the whiteboard. All of the best practices that we see in a traditional classroom, we want that to be able to come alive in an online or in a remote environment as well.
Great. And already we have some questions coming in from the audience. Maybe Charlie, I'll throw this first one coming in. Is remote teaching approved by the school board? So I guess a kind of more general question about that is, when you see districts coming on board with a solution like that, talk about some of those dynamics. How long does it take? Again, where are the approvals coming from? Do you find that this is kind of a ground up solution, or one where you have a top down where an administrator has to be the champion of it?
Sure. And I could speak specific to Baltimore City Schools, which is, a district I've worked with really since I was hired back in 2016, because it really did evolve over time. To answer the question, I guess in short, yes, most of the contracts I'm working on do require school board approval. I think that's just because of the resources commitment that you're doing, but you're creating a new program essentially, and it requires resources that are going to involve school board approval. But I do think you want to make sure that the community is aware that the district is needing to think outside of the box to provide instructional equity, at scale. So, in Baltimore, kind of going back to what Rick was saying, right? We've always worked with them in the matter of, providing asynchronous curriculum content, and that was rooted in not having enough world language teachers across, 85 different middle schools in Baltimore City.
Wow.
That evolved to kind of, we could pair that with remote teachers to really enrich that experience, so it's not just that kind of computer lab working in a software, enriching that with a teacher who is blending instruction and speaking Spanish with students, in a webinar setting. But that really kind of rolled into the more exacerbated shortage, of this past school year. And I give a lot of credit to Baltimore because they really did think about this programmatically, right? Like, as Rick was saying, that they've had a teacher shortage prior to this school year, and I think it became time when it started to go into some of the tested subjects, at the volume of classrooms that they were looking at and the volume, of shortages this year. They needed a program that could be created. And there is a director of virtual learning now, and all those departments are in place now post-pandemic that really weren't there pre-pandemic. So there's professional infrastructures there, there's technology infrastructures that are there, now with the volume of devices that are there 1-to-1 and in some cases 2-to-1 at certain campuses, so students can have a device at home and a device in classroom and be assured that they'll have access. So there's a lot of things in place now that allowed Baltimore to create a program for principals to opt into. And we can talk about that more, but that's a big piece of it, right? You've created a program, this kind of cater of remote teachers for, approved subject areas, but ultimately principals have to think deeply about, will this fit at my school, with the staff that I have, do I have enough, facilitators to cover these classrooms to pair with a remote teacher? And that's going to look different school to school to school and principal to principal to principal. And each school is kind of its own mini implementation, and it creates more work, but it is for the better for the school and for the student experience for sure. Sorry, long.
No, it's super important that our teachers become a part of that school family and that school faculty. And so that's how we kind of approach the partnership, especially in Baltimore City that Charlie was referencing, but also in the other school districts that that we've implemented remote instruction. It's really important that, that if, for instance, if there's a professional learning community set up for middle school science in, XYZ middle school, that our teachers, if we're being deployed in that school, that they participate in that way, and that they are, members of that faculty to the best, to the best that they possibly can be, given that they're working remotely. And that's, it's really been encouraging. It's been, it's been really effective. I think it's actually benefited not only our remote instructor who is, becoming a part of that family or that faculty, but it's also benefited the brick and mortar partners that they have, that level of collaboration. There are some things that are going really well in their remote instruction. Hey, how come your scores were better than mine on that last summative assessment? What are you doing that I'm not doing? That professional collaboration we're seeing more and more. So I don't, it's not necessarily a top down, but it's certainly, the whole village, kind of concept. Right. Where, obviously we have to get board approval to be able to do this. That's where the contracts happen. That's where the business side happens. But where the rubber meets the road, where instruction is happening and where students are on the receiving end, there's a high level of collaboration, not only between our teacher and the classroom facilitator, but our leadership staff and the school leadership staff. We all have to be working towards that same goal, which is successful student outcomes.
Another great question that came in here, and I know that we have these great technology solutions, but we still have the real world, especially of public education, when it comes to state certifications and unions and various other policies and regulations that make up the infrastructure of the 15,000 different school districts that we have here in the United States. So a specific question came in: will a certified teacher outside of my state be eligible to teach in my state remotely? Maybe you guys both could talk a little bit about some of those political particulars.
So, I mean, obviously that's a challenge, right? And so, using reciprocity and, and many of the state reciprocity laws, we're able to, kind of leverage a national recruiting base and be able to get teachers certified in the various states in which we want to implement this program with, so Charlie mentioned Baltimore City as an example. Many of the instructors that we had, kind of ready to go day one when they needed instruction weren't Maryland certified yet, but they were in the process of getting Maryland certified, and using reciprocity, we're able to get that certification within the first couple of weeks of the implementation. And that's been our experience long before remote instruction. We've been, organizations like ours have been, meeting that challenge for years and years and years, and traditional online options across the country. Wish there was a national online certification, some sort of national board of online that would make it easier. There's 50 DOEs you have to work through. Some are super easy. Some make it incredibly complex. But we know where those are, and and we have a lot of experience kind of navigating those waters, right, to get our folks as many state certifications as they possibly can, which gives us the most flexibility that we can to help out schools in need.
Right. Yeah, Charlie. So I mean, I'm in New Jersey, so I know some of those particulars there. Baltimore County, I assume there's some hoops that need to be gone through.
Certainly. I mean, and at this level of dedicated service that we're providing Baltimore, I mean, they view our services, in some ways as a contractor teacher. So you're going through, a lot of processes, teacher to teacher to teacher, that we are lining up to support this program, through all those pieces like background checks and fingerprinting. And we have to go through all the nuts and bolts with their, human capital office to get that, much of which is hard paper copy things, right, that you have to go to the office and get it and send it to each teacher. And it does require a lot of kind of back end logistics, but those are all things that we are providing as part of the, service to the district, right? Obviously we have the teachers, but, those teachers have supervisors and, people on Rick's teams that are making all that work behind the scenes, which is a big piece. And of course, time and a runway makes a big difference, right? But, in the nature of this conversation, it makes sense to us. Every district is going to exhaust every local option first, and then they're going to bring in third parties as their plan B and C, and that's just the nature of this conversation. But if forecasts are demonstrating shortages, if we can start having conversations now versus in August, that obviously makes a huge difference, and I know Rick can attest to that
for sure.
Yeah, and it seems too that, I mean, a lot of there were so many harsh realities, right, thrust upon us over these past couple of years. But as you said, Rick, I mean, like, the difference between maybe what before was a nice to have, if you were a remote school, you wanted to bring in a French teacher, to where you're really talking about a new staffing model for many schools. Maybe talk about that model pre-pandemic. Now you were talking about the facilitators, the in-person facilitators, and that connection that they need to have with your remote staff. Can you go a little deeper into that and talk about how those relationships are developed? Are there any particular, professional development, or is it just by nature of being around each other on Zoom enough, change behaviors to the way we live now?
You have to be intentional. That's a great question, Kevin. What we have found, and this shouldn't surprise anybody, everything is intentional. Okay. We have a profile, we've done this for a couple of years now. We have a profile of what a great classroom facilitator, what sort of traits and what sort of experiences will lend somebody to be a great classroom facilitator. And unsurprisingly, they're not different from, what would make a great classroom teacher either, right? It's, they gotta love kids. They have to be there for student success. They have to be, it's a thankless gig at times and all of that, but there's a greater bigger purpose at hand. And so we help our partner school districts, in providing those profiles, getting creative and problem solving around, potentially, leveraging local universities and state colleges and anybody who might be in an education program that might be a pre-service teacher. This is a great opportunity for them to get classroom management experience, real, meaningful, classroom management experience while they're, completing their education degrees. Local leaders, the civic leaders, etc., retired, public servants, whatever the case may be. We're looking for folks that, that love kids, right? And then we got to give them the training. We have several different implementation models. One that includes everything happening in our platform and our ecosystem. So those folks are going to need a lot of professional development in and around, what that looks like from the student's experience and how they can, assist and facilitate student learning. So we're going to provide that for them. But there's, whether they're using our platforms or whether, like in Baltimore City, where we are 100% using Baltimore City platforms, they need, there are some classroom management, professional development opportunities, et cetera. And so we have a suite of, of those sessions for them. We like to do that obviously well in advance. We want time additionally for the content teacher and for that classroom facilitator to have true planning time, right? We don't want to, certainly don't want them meeting 5 minutes before first period on the first day of school. So we want them to have time, it's probably going to be in this environment, right? In Microsoft Teams or in Zoom or whatever, but for them to get to know each other, for them to plan together. It's important that the classroom facilitator knows what's going to be taught. They don't have to be an expert in biology, but we need to know what's coming, right? And that kind of stuff. And so we have to be very intentional about that time. And what we have found is the more time that the two individuals have to work together and plan together, the deeper the relationship, and the better the experience for the students.
And I would add too, and Rick said it a little bit earlier, all those things that Rick is talking about, classroom management, building student relationships, thinking about all the various social, emotional needs of each individual student in a classroom. That's a skill set. That is absolutely a skill set that takes planning. Even thinking back to when I was a teacher, right? I had to dedicate just as much time to classroom management planning and routines and how this transition is going to go, just as much planning to that, as to, the mechanics of the lesson and the pedagogy and the building the worksheets, right? And I think what is made clear in these implementations is, you're just, what was one adult is now two. And that thinking of specializing on your roles and responsibilities are just maintaining, the environment. But it also does push, that adult to think about those things that are also big problems that you hear from school district and school leaders is the increasing social emotional needs of students that can inhibit learning. And I do think it does kind of force an honest conversation and a calculus from a principal staffing perspective over, what am I likely to hire? Who do I have at my disposal to bring into this building to meet the needs of my students? And I do think it adds tools to a principal's tool belt to think in those terms, right? I've got some people here who know my student community, who are good with these kids, who can manage the classroom, but they're not compliant teachers, and I can't be compliant, but it does give that extra tool in the tool belt. And it is a different model. But, as Rick said earlier, it's certainly working, and you're seeing, what the formula is for each role to make that work well.
Yeah. Let's go back to one of the poll questions where I asked whether there were differences between grade levels, and I guess we kind of split up between elementary, middle school, and high school. Rick, talk from your experiences, just overall, but then maybe there have been some changes there too since the pandemic. How do you see those models skewing?
So we have this model in place in middle and high school. We don't have any examples of remote instruction in the K-5 classroom, and I think it's it's probably pretty instinctual why that hasn't happened yet. Much in the same way that 20 years ago we weren't, we didn't have a lot of K-5 virtual school instruction either. There's probably there are some additional considerations to really think about in that K-5 world, right? And so I don't see that coming anytime soon. They're right. 6-year-olds getting all of their instruction via the remote model with the teacher on the big screen is probably we're probably a ways away from that. Right.
Yeah, that beta test that beta test during the pandemic, I think, kind of proved that one out.
Yeah, pretty much. Right. We are in place. Probably it's probably skewed a little more at the high school level. Maybe like a 40%, 60% middle school to high school. Is where we're currently seeing our implementations, which probably makes sense as well. Okay, the classrooms still look the same. The kids are more mature. We're seeing that kind of skew that way. Charlie, that's what you're seeing too, right? Baltimore City is pretty spread out across, right? It's pretty equal.
It's pretty evenly split, middle school, high school. Certainly, as subject areas go, there's a larger representation of math than ELA. They really went into this with like math and ELA. Those are our tested subjects. Those are the ones we want to prioritize, but it definitely skews more towards math. And then, we also over time were approved for middle school sciences. And then we do support some Spanish classrooms as well, but yeah, we don't see, any elementary usage, and we're not approved for that.
Let's go a little bit deeper here. Can you give a description of kind of the day-to-day experience? Say I'm walking into third period math as a sophomore in high school. Is this like a one-to-many sort of where the bell rings and then the facilitator? Give us a little bit of a walkthrough.
So yes, right. So I'm that, and we'll say math because that seems to be the theme. I'm the student, and on my schedule I have third period algebra 1. So my first period might have been health, and then I went to an English class where I had three-dimensional teachers, right, traditional teachers in front of me, and then I walk into my third period class, room 101, and I'm greeted by a classroom facilitator. Okay, so from my perspective, everything looks the same, right? We're coming into class, I'm taking my seat, and then I'm welcomed on this. Hopefully, in the best of implementations, I am looking at my device, got my headphones in, and I'm looking at my device, and my teacher of record, my remote teacher is there, ready, probably with a warm up of some kind. It's going to look it's going to have the look and feel and best instructional practices of a traditional classroom, with the remote instructor kind of guiding and directing that classroom remotely with the help of that classroom facilitator. There's going to be if you can imagine it, the technology allows us to do it, right? So a one to many 10-minute mini lesson to start off the class on, and I always say fractions. Anybody that, people are going to watch this later and like, there are other things taught in math besides fractions, right? But I always say, right? Right, a little 10-minute mini lesson on dividing fractions, and and then some guided practice, and then perhaps three or four kids that need remediation from last week's unit exam were put into a breakout room, and while the remaining class is getting started on tonight's homework, the our certified remote instructor is working with those 3 or 4 kids in a small group breakout session, providing that, intervention, remediation, instruction. So really, with the technology being what it is today, in terms of, whether it's Zoom or some other platform, there's, we can make come alive. We can replicate what happens in a traditional environment. And that's what we're committed to doing. So that's what it would look like. Then the bell would ring, and gather up your stuff, fold up your laptop, and off the 4th period where, you might have a 3-dimensional teacher again.
Right.
And I think too, it's funny when you walk in those classrooms, if it's the model Rick is describing where students are one-to-one and they have headphones in, you're not hearing the teacher's voice. So it's eerily quiet, right?
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
Students participate, as they're being called on, thinking in like the direct instruction piece, right? That first 20, 30 minutes of class or something after the warm up, but teachers teaching and they're listening and they're, answering questions, but it's quieter than the 3-dimensional teacher. And I do think too, talking to district leaders and as they visit and think about classrooms, right? It's like, there's this thinking that's like, well, it's quiet. It's like the teacher's teaching. That's sage on a stage, right? We want to see our student groups and a Socratic seminar and all those things that we want with our best teachers, that controlled chaos, and you start to see that evolve, I think. And that does require a lot of what Rick is talking about earlier. That takes the planning. That is when the remote teacher has to plan those pieces that involve the physical space or maybe a different settings with the desk. They have to plan that in partnership with the facilitator. But I do think it's important to understand that if you can't achieve the former, getting to the latter is very difficult, right? And I think that's important to think about, right? If you can't get the kids in, from a management perspective, with their headphones in, with their devices, engaging in the lesson, answering question in the more kind of traditional format, getting to that controlled chaos with all the parts and pieces of having a remote teacher and a facilitator, you need to accomplish the first before you get to the latter. And I think that
Charlie hit on something really important in what he was saying, and that's that we've spent a lot of time visiting these classrooms, right? Because strong instructional leadership is, the number one tenet is visibility, and so whether it's the principal or some sort of content leader from the school staff, district staff, or it's our staff. I mean, we've been very intentional. We have visited these major implementations, several times throughout the school year. We have sent folks. We have dedicated staff that's in the area that spends a lot of time visiting classrooms and what we have seen. And this also should be relatively intuitive as well. We have seen an evolution of the instruction over time, right? In those first couple of weeks, which also, by the way, is not unusual in a traditional classroom, where the kids are getting used to the environment that the teacher is creating. They're getting used to the instruction. They're getting they're getting into their rhythm. That takes a little getting into the rhythm in this environment as well. And so what we're seeing here at the end of May in these remote instructed classrooms, it looks significantly different than it did in the beginning of August when we were first visiting, which is fascinating and encouraging all at the same time, right? Because there's a comfort level that's being created for the kids, and so that it's not this weird thing. This, I'm dating myself. It's not this like Max Headroom video man in the box, right? Talking to me. That person's real, right? They've called my house just like my biology teacher did. They spoke to my mom and talked about how well I was doing, just like my Spanish teacher did. And in addition to that, I've got this really great classroom facilitator who's got my back too. And I'm getting what I need. I'm getting really quality instruction.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
I was just going to say too, I mean, we talked so much earlier about that specialization of roles, and like relationships live on, with the facilitator, but that's, that obviously bridges across to the teacher too. I mean, when you talk to students, if you look at the survey results from the thousands of students in Baltimore, if you're talking to that learning coach, or the school leader, some of the feedback is explicitly like, we want Mrs. Torres back at Charm City Virtual Academy next year.
Yeah.
We love Mrs. Torres, right? And that is a big piece. It's also not uncommon for these teachers to, send, care packages to the class and things like that, incentive systems. You do see a lot of that, and the kids are certainly appreciative.
Well, that leads to a question I had about, student behavior and their comfort with this technology and learning in this way. I think people of a certain age have concerns about how, well, this is how I learned, and now this is the way you do it. But on the other hand, now we look at some of the new realities of flexible work in the way that society is going. I mean, this is really the way you need to learn how to learn, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of focus in the early part of this century around 21st century skills.
Yes.
There's a lot of curriculum around developing 21st century skills. This can't be any more embedded, into what we're doing. You're absolutely correct. I mean, we're the nature of the conversation that we're having right now, the platform in which we're having it, the folks that we're talking to today, and then the folks that will watch this on demand some other time, mirrors what these kids are being exposed to right now. So it's not out of the ordinary for them. There's, we're going back to the, 21st century skills and digital natives and digital immigrants, and those of us that are immigrants might go, it's not possible. But then we're not remembering our past either, where, when there was videotape instruction, or whatever, that's how, is that really significantly different than what's happening right now? It's really not, right? And so, there's a paradigm shift that I think happens quicker in our kids than it does in our grownups. Are there discipline problems? Of course there are. They're 14 years old, I mean, they forget their device, I was 14, and I left my history book at home, so of course there are, right? And so, but they're not worse, and in many cases, the classrooms are, quite frankly, look, I've talked to a lot of folks, a lot of administrators in the districts in which we've implemented this, and, and some of those classrooms are way better than next door. Maybe it is the quiet factor that everybody's kind of have, that everybody has their headsets on and they're dialed in and they're dialed into the instruction. Maybe it's not, but there's always going to be discipline issues. They're certainly not any worse. And in a lot of ways, the classrooms are humming along at a much better pace.
I think one of the big, even within this model, right, and thinking in terms of like generational, ideas of different instructional models, even within this, you see a lot of, from a management perspective, if the devices aren't there, right? If 4 out of 20 students walk into the room and they're like, I forgot my Chromebook today, guess I can't, do math, right? Which 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds or whatever occasionally will do,
Dog ate my notebook.
Right.
Right.
Should they share another computer, right? Because this happens nearly every day and in nearly every class, right? In some school systems and in some schools, you do see a 2-to-1 for that exact reason. There's a laptop cart and there's a Chromebook at home, so that you don't have to run into this. But that's the reality is that's not going to be the case in a lot of places. And so it begs the question: can students use their own personal device, aka their phone, to consume their lesson, right? And Rick and I, and talking to the instructional leaders, it's like, no, let's stick with the plan, right? Use the device, right? Let's problem solve around this. But it does kind of create it begs the conversation, right? And if you hear the students, they'll say, well, I learned fine on my phone, right? And it's one of is that one of those things? It's like, oh, of course you do. Or is it like, no, actually they just do. They're so
They actually do. Yeah.
it's like looking at you on my, device, which is essentially a small tablet or computer, right, is not so different. And it's a viable plan B to not having my Chromebook today. So I just think that's interesting.
Absolutely. So another question from the audience. So this is great if you're doing a handful of classes, but I have 75 different courses with 150 to 200 students. How does this work? So a question of scale for you.
Yeah, I saw that and I really wasn't, probably need to have some more information about what that, about the school setting, et cetera. It sounds like a small school with, and so, it is a question of scale. What we're talking about right now is, is a relatively specific implementation, at the school level. It differs from traditional virtual school or, traditional online learning in that, the kid is in the building, the kid is following a bell schedule, and this may be one class of 6 that's being instructed this way because, we're helping the school and the school district mitigate that specific problem. So another way in which we've been able to frame this issue is in those smaller classrooms and being able to, teach in the same way across multiple campuses, potentially across multiple classrooms, and, we're able to have this discussion and we're probably in 6 different states. Well, there's only 3 of us, so 3 different states, but, people that are listening are across the country, across the spectrum. So, we've talked with partners about, an AP class that perhaps the high school only has 4 kids that want to take that class, but that class is also offered at the neighboring high school. If we can get that scheduled at the same time, we can work around economies of scale. We can have one teacher remoted in to multiple sites, to be able to expand the offerings of that school district. I don't know that addresses the specific question of our audience member. Probably need to hear a little bit more about how that school is set up and what would be the best way to implement. But that would make sense for her, for that school.
Well, and a third variable too is whether if you are going to blend the model with asynchronous content, right? That's another variable that changes time and how much you need to have someone on a schedule. So that's another consideration too.
Yeah, it looks like we're talking about an online program, not a brick and mortar setting from, just reading the follow-up comment. So, I think we could achieve scalability in that way because it's a virtual program. So it's scheduling flexibility, et cetera. So we just have to talk about it some more.
Yep. Great. Thanks everybody for all these great questions. Another one coming in, is US citizenship compulsory even for remote teaching? If yes, are there some options for international teachers through this platform?
So there's no universal rule around that. So it's hard to answer that in the abstract. So I don't know the answer to that. Certainly something that we could take a look at and find out. Citizenship versus where you're located are 2 completely different things. There are dual citizenship responsibilities. So I not knowing enough about the individual state governments and the requirements, et cetera. I don't kind of feel like I'm qualified to answer that, but it's certainly something for us to take a look at as an industry.
Well, I always remember that one of the big selling points for remote teaching
Yeah,
going years back was to have your French teacher in France, right?
sure. Right. Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about the dynamic after the school bell rings and kids go home. I mean, anytime, anywhere learning was right up there, Rick, I think with 21st century skills. What does that dynamic look like at homework time, or when it comes to having a conversation with mom and dad?
Well, I mean, kind of our out of the box model, and it's been this way forever, in the, with K-12 and with the Stride Learning Solutions, is that we want to maintain, the instructional momentum, throughout the day. We want to be available to our kids. This model, in that it's not the traditional, online instructional model. It more mirrors the school day and more of the brick and mortar experience. We're certainly committed to delivering that while also not losing, the value add of the content being available to the kids, 24/7, obviously. So in those cases where we're implementing remote instruction while also using our platforms and our content, the kid really gets both experiences, right? They get the traditional brick and mortar instruction experience while also having their learning opportunities extended, for as long as they need them to be, right? So, having access to and being able to, to submit work, et cetera, and get assistance from our, academic support team, and all of those things are extended as long as the student needs them to be, in those situations where we're, like in the Baltimore City, where we're using their systems, we're using their platform, et cetera, to the extent that that's possible. And I suspect that it is, right? Digital content is available whenever you can dial in, and, the same holds true. And as far as our teachers developing relationships with the families, that's a tenet of ours, right? That's, those are table stakes for being an instructor in our organization. We want that to be, frequent. We want that to be informative. We want those relationships because we know that if our teachers, have been able to develop great relationships with their kids and their kids' support group, then we know that the students have far more likelihood to be successful with us, right? And so, we're very intentional around that, making, synchronous contact with our families on a regular, at least monthly basis.
Yeah. Now, I knew that the toughest part of my job this afternoon would be to end the conversation. There's so many aspects of this and so many great insights that both you gentlemen have already shared with us. But maybe as we wrap things up here, I'll kind of ask you for a horizon question. So now we've kind of emerged. We talked about the past. We talked about the pandemic and kind of our emergence out of that. What are we looking at in the next couple of years? I mean, does this continue to be an explosion? Is it an evolution? Are there other innovations that have come out of this forced beta test of remote teaching and learning into whatever this new hybrid is? Give me and give the audience just a little bit of what they can expect. All things, let's keep the glasses half full. That we continue to emerge from the pandemic, and teachers and students continue to become comfortable with these technologies. Charlie, maybe I'll put you on the hot seat first. I mean, what are you looking at down the line, say in the next 3 to 5 years?
I keep coming back to the idea of just like the specialization aspect of it. And I have to think that this recalibrates a little bit from an HR perspective, in the long term, what is needed in a brick and mortar site, right? Do you need it to be all, math teacher, English teacher, Spanish, and think of it in terms of the subject area and having a compliant certified teacher there, or is what is important in the building, in the space, in the environment, something a little bit different? with the evolving needs of students. Might this model show school leaders, show districts that, how we design schools can look and feel different? And I don't think that that's necessarily a new idea, but when rubber meets the road and you're thinking in terms of HR, right, might you create new roles that are more specialized in terms of, what it takes to manage space, to make spaces conducive to learning for a remote instructor, and to address, the social emotional needs of students that is an increasing issue, I think, for schools and districts.
So I'm going to steal from Charlie. I've heard him say this a lot of times, and so I want to make sure that because it's such a great point that he makes. He referenced specialization, and the story, the analogy that he always gives is the specialization within the medical field now. You used to go to a doctor, right? Or actually, doctor used to come to you, and now there are that general profession has been broken up into specific specializations, and I really, we are in the age of customization. We are in the age of individualization, and schools have been slow to respond to that, and so they're not only public schools in particular are losing students, but losing teachers that are also not looking to be generalists anymore. And this model allows for a certain level of specialization, and it is not new. I tell the story all the time that I was a freshman economics student at the University of Florida in 1984. And Dr. David Denslow was my teacher, and he taught the class once at 7 o'clock in the morning. I did not go to the 7 o'clock in the morning class. I went to the 10 o'clock in the morning class sometimes, and I watched him on videotape, right? But the University of Florida and that department decided that it was important that one of the leading economics minds of our century taught those kids. And so we have unbelievable teachers in America that are just fantastic. And some of them are really great at teaching a portion of their subject matter. Like they're the best at that. They're super good at the other stuff. But they are the preeminent instructor in subtopic A of Algebra 1. They should be in front of as many kids as possible. And this is a way to scratch that surface, to kind of tear down some of these kind of real walls, and then but also fake walls that we place our learners in. And and so that's my horizon. I hope from this crisis, and make no mistake about it, this is a crisis that we are in, comes a reimagined educational experience for kids where we're putting the best people in front of them regardless of geography.
Well, agree 100%. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I see that our time is about up, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I'd like to thank both of you for a really informative presentation, and I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating, and have a great day.